Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Amita Rari, coming up in today's newscast. U.S. Secretary of State issuing stark warning Israeli unrest hinders prospects of Israel-Saudi Arabia normalization agreement. Meantime, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dropping some judicial reform plans amidst public outcry and international concerns, stressing strong ties with the United States. And finally, a taste of the Holy Land's finest expert with ILTV's Wine of the Week. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that the path of the Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia is being hampered by Israeli policies in Judea and Samaria. It was part of a stark warning that all normalization with the Arab world depends on policies on the ground. ILTV's Steve Leibovich reports.
U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said that ongoing unrest in the territories has made U.S. efforts to broker a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia a lot tougher, if not impossible.
We've told our friends and allies in Israel that if there's a fire burning in their backyard, it's going to be a lot tougher, if not impossible, to actually both deepen the existing agreements as well as to expand them to include potentially Saudi Arabia.
It was the starkest warning yet from the Biden administration that Israeli policy in Judea and Samaria has harmed efforts to further integrate Israel into the region. Blinken pleaded for change.
Our judgment is Israel's closest friend and ally, profoundly not in Israel's interest for this to happen, both because of the added degree of difficulty that this presents for pursuing normalization agreements or deepening them, but also because of the practical consequences.
Last week, in response to Israeli moves to expand settlements, Morocco canceled plans to host a highly anticipated summit for foreign ministers from Israel, the U.S., and several Arab countries.
Israel is cracking down on Jewish vigilantes in Judea and Samaria. Defense Minister Gallant ordered 4 of those arrested for disturbances to be held for 6 months in administrative detention without charges on suspicion of involvement in recent attacks against Palestinians. The Chief of Staff weighed in on the importance of the issue. Back to ILTV's Steve Leibovich.
The 4 Jewish vigilante suspects placed in administrative detention for 6 months were allegedly responsible for torching Palestinian homes and cars last week in Arab towns in Samaria. The measure is rarely used against Jewish Israelis and comes amid a recent spate of vigilante attacks on Palestinian villages, which followed a Palestinian terror shooting that killed 4 Israelis last week. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant signed the detention orders in line with recommendations from the Shin Bet Security Service. A senior defense official said that the 4 detainees have been involved for years in violent incidents, both open and secret. Meanwhile, the IDF Chief of Staff made it clear that the army will crack down on Jewish vigilantes and had harsh words for politicians who have criticized the army's firm stand against lawlessness. At an officer graduation ceremony in the South, Chief of Staff Hirsch warned that troops who don't interfere in settler attacks on Palestinians cannot be officers. Halevi told the new officers that alongside protecting Israel's borders, foiling Palestinian terror, and fighting in wars, they will also encounter complex challenges of Jewish vigilante violence.
And joining us now to elaborate on the topic is former head of the military's prosecution office for Judea and Samaria, Lieutenant Colonel Reserves and Attorney Maurice Hirsch. Maurice, administrative detention for Jewish vigilantes, it seems pretty extreme. Why not charge them instead? I mean, what is the status of an Israeli citizen placed under administrative detention, and why would the Shin Bet recommend it?
So we have to understand really what administrative detention is. Administrative detention, as opposed to criminal proceedings, is a measure that looks forward. It looks at preventing a danger posed by that person for an act that he's more likely to commit in the future, rather than punishing someone for something that they did in the past. That's what criminal law does. It punishes you for an act that you did in the past. Whereas administrative detention says, well, we're going to take your basis of your actions until now. We're going to see whether there are other plans that you intend to carry out which will cause harm and danger on a really wide-scale extent, and therefore we're going to employ the measure of administrative detention. In its essence, administrative detention balances between the right to life of the general public and the right to freedom of the individual who is planning to carry out some type of terrorist attack.
Very interesting. Now, Maurice, currently about how many Palestinians and how many Israeli citizens are in administration, and have those numbers been dropping or maybe rising?
So there are actually a lot of Palestinian terrorists in administrative detention. You can really draw a parallel between the level of violence on the streets and the number of people in administrative detention. I remember when serving in the IDF, when there were just 5 Palestinian administrative detainees, and the level of violence had dropped down tremendously. But as soon as you see the terrorists being released, so the level of violence goes up. So at the moment you have, I think, almost over 1,000 Palestinians, terrorists in administrative detention, and it's saving, I would imagine, thousands of Israeli lives, and the lives of just innocent tourists wandering around the streets who didn't expect to be murdered by Palestinian terrorists. On the other hand, and in the comparison, when the level of violence and definitely the level of terrorism on the Israeli side is much less, you see administrative detention being used on a much more cautious basis and a much more specific basis, just to deal with the terrorists within Israeli society who are really planning to carry out really generally very severe acts of terrorism.
Now, the chief of staff told new IDF officers that they must act when facing Jewish vigilantes attacking Palestinians. Now, we know that there has been damage done to Palestinian property, especially after deadly terror attacks. But do Israeli officers need to be told to help innocent Palestinian civilians? What do you think?
Without question. Part of the goal of the Israeli soldiers is to enforce the law. They cannot decide that we're enforcing the law against Palestinians only and allowing Israeli civilians to indiscriminately attack Palestinians. It's not the same level, obviously. One is the level of organized, PA-sponsored and terrorist organization-sponsored terrorism against Israel in order to wipe out Israel, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the Israelis who are sporadic Israelis involved in sporadic events, not in an organized and definitely not state-sponsored or sanctioned fashion. And so the Israeli soldiers really do have to enforce the law where they can, and they do it on a regular basis. Sometimes they have to do it with a little bit more force than we see, but it's something which happens on a daily basis.
You're saying enough force. Are they trained enough, IDF soldiers, to do it, to deal with these things?
Well, so obviously it's definitely not preferable for the IDF soldiers to be operating against the civilian population, definitely not the Israeli civilian population. But in instances such as Jeddah and Samaria, I think there is no other alternative. And as part of the training of the forces for their general duties, obviously when they go to enforce the law against Palestinians, when they go to arrest a Palestinian, they're trained how to do that, how to handcuff the suspect, how to handcuff the terrorist. Sometimes you're dealing with mass murderers, and yet once you have them under arrest, you have to make sure that handcuffs, for example, are applied in a manner which doesn't cause unnecessary harm, unnecessary pain. When you're dealing with sometimes 13 and 14-year-old terrorists who are coming to murder Jews. So the soldiers are trained how to really treat those minors in a humane way, treat the adults in a humane way. And that's not something which is really too difficult to teach. The soldiers come with that approach of a value-based system, that we're not here to just indiscriminately cause damage to the other side. Even if we have to enforce the law, we enforce the law in a humane manner. And it's something which is an integral part of their training. So just making sure that is possibly just reinforced, a reminder courses, refresher courses as to what needs to be done and the different procedures is something which I don't think should be too difficult to see also brought to fruition in the field itself.
Maurice Hirsch, thank you so much for joining us today. Dealing with this important problem is definitely something that has to be done here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.